After spending just over a year reading Super Sentai vs. Power Rangers, I feel like I have been beaten with the toys of the weapons from the show repeatedly, though the bruises are on the inside instead of the outside. Even without the emotional attachment a fan would have for these characters and the shows they came from, Super Sentai vs. Power Rangers fails in a variety of other ways. So many that I could make a giant list. So I will. Number 1. The premise. I want to stress that there is a difference between a story's concept and the story's premise. The concept is the initial idea, call it the spark that drives someone to create any form of media. And a crossover between Super Sentai and Power Rangers is one that many can get behind. Unfortunately, that's where the good ends. Aizuki's premise is flawed from the very start. The first issue is he decided to have all the action center around the Super Sentai universe. It begins with a Sentai villain assembling a group of villains, a Sentai team assembling a group of other teams together, and the arrival of characters from the Power Rangers universe is just sort of a thing that happens. We only get a vague idea as to why the Rangers are even here. Random portals bringing the heroes to the Super Sentai universe, and a small number of villains are inexplicably resurrected by accident, and are just going along for the ride. Which leads me to my next point. Number 2, the structure. I don't know exactly what Aizuki was thinking when he decided to involve time travel, especially when all the Sentai veterans still exist in the present day. However, based on statements made by the Jetmen and the Zordon-era Power Rangers, I believe it may have something to do with age. The characters that go on missions to the past repeatedly show their admiration to the past heroes, but focus exclusively on their youth. It leaves me with the impression that Aizuki didn't find the past characters interesting or able to participate in the events of the story unless they were young. It's kind of creepy when you realize the Sentai characters that are allowed to be regulars are characters from the early 2000s onward, with the others being hand-waved away as somewhere else. Almost like the time travel concept is only in the story so we could have these characters in their prime, before dropping them off for the next one on the list. But aside from the unfortunate implications, there's also the time travel itself. There is nothing here. The characters just go from point A to B because the plot wills it. They do things just because. It's repetitive and dull. A group of modern heroes are selected to go to the past based on their color and the author's bias in more than a few cases. They go to the past heroes initially don't believe them about being from the present. The modern villains join forces with the past villains. They make a monster, antics ensue before the monster is taken out. First by the past hero's team finisher, and then again with their giant robot. You might think that's being true to both series, but there's a slight problem with that. Number 3. Substance. Super Sentai and Power Rangers has its share of repetition, but the reason both shows have lasted so long is because they're able to take familiar patterns and do something different with them. Sean Aizuki, unfortunately, does not do this. Each and every villain confrontation is the same, sometimes even with similar dialogue, just with the names switched around, and this goes double for the heroes. You may have noticed that the bulk of the past heroes and assembled modern heroes are just sort of there, with the red and pink heroes being the ones with the most dialogue and the most to do in the chapter. Exceptions exist, but it pains me to admit these chapters tend to be worse than usual. Which leads us to an ongoing issue. Number 4. The characters. Yeah, what characters? The majority of the cast act without character. As I read this, I kept track of which characters are written properly, and I came up with 5. All of whom are from the Super Sentai universe, and none from the Power Rangers. But that's a separate issue entirely. The rest? Many of them are interchangeable with a very clear indication their place in the story was decided either by their powers, color, or a tiny similarity they have with another character. Some are lucky enough to get some kind of token acknowledgement of their true personality, usually a ham-fisted line that was tossed in for the sake of appeasing someone who mentioned it in the comments section of the story. It doesn't help that there's too many fucking characters, which only calls attention to how bland they are. And the ones that do have some kind of character are so inaccurate to their original selves that it is baffling as to how Aizuki managed to get them wrong. Well, okay, there is one specific thing about these characters and why they are portrayed incorrectly. Let's start with the worst example, Radiguet, who instead of being written like the proactive, pragmatic monster who fought his way to the top of the totem pole he was in Jetman, he's a literal god that can force other villains to serve him and do whatever the plot calls for, just because. This chick's personality is tossed aside so she can be a mouthpiece for Exuki, unsubtly trying to push certain couples. These characters serve no purpose in the plot except to get humiliated and put through crap in some extremely mean-spirited ways. And this woman is here to allude to an unrelated character in an extremely offensive way. And now that I've brought up Trini, I better talk about what holds the story down more than any other element. Number 5. Favoritism. This part actually requires to be split into separate sections since Exuki's favoritism causes failures for different reasons. Part A. The Super Sentai heroes. Exuki made no effort to hide the fact he prefers Super Sentai over Power Rangers. And that's unavoidable. No matter how objective a person tries to be, they will have some personal bias. Now, a good writer would be able to keep that bias to themselves, but Exuki is not a good writer. All throughout this story, it's the Sentai characters that get the most amount of story time, it's the Sentai universe that our heroes and villains are fighting over, and it's the Sentai characters that we are told are the most powerful. Noteworthy examples include the villains consisting mostly of Sentai villains with only 3 Power Rangers villains appearing at a time. Over and over again, we are told this new incarnation of the United of Evil is better than the previous one. Every time a Monster of the Week is taken out, it's by a Sentai hero, and it's the powers of the Red Sentai heroes that are given to Cole by Aka Red. There's even favoritism among the Sentai characters. Chokan is in charge of the good guys for no reason. Same with Radiguet as to why he is in charge of the villains. And to say Exuki took every opportunity he could to shove the Shinkenkers in would be an understatement. Why do you think it was established Ichio wanted to create his own Bokengers and Deca Rangers rather than just his own team? Because those are teams from shows Exuki absolutely adored. Part B. The Power Rangers. Whenever a Power Rangers character is introduced in this story, there is always a moment where they go out of their way to point out how inferior they are to the Sentai characters. Almost all of Jaden's dialogue consists of self-deprecation at the expense of himself and the other Samurai Rangers, in order to put the Shinkenkers, Takaru specifically, on a pedestal. But this is at its most despicable with the Mighty Morphin team. If you allow me to use another series for comparison, one of the many problems people had with Mass Effect 3's ending was the fact that Commander Shepard, the character we had been playing for 3 games up to that point, does not argue with the Catalyst nonsense, despite how much evidence points to the Catalyst being full of shit. And because Shepard does not argue, we are just supposed to accept it, because Shepard has the player's trust. It was a manipulative act on BioWare's part, and it's just as manipulative when Exuki does it. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers hold a special place in the hearts of many fans, including any potential readers of his story. They have the seniority, the admiration, and the trust of the fans. And if they're saying the Sentai characters are better than them, then we're supposed to just accept it. But we won't. Because we called out BioWare for pulling this crap in Mass Effect 3, and I am calling Exuki out now for thinking he could manipulate his readers. Part C. The fan service. Besides having characters Exuki likes being in the most important roles, there's also the blatant pushing of characters Exuki finds attractive to the forefront. The need to pair up certain characters seems to actually have higher priorities to the story than the actual plot. Because with the possible exception of Billy and Ranu, all of them consist of characters Exuki finds hot. It's why I hate Cole's role in the story so much. He was given Aka Red's powers because Rick Medina was a very ripped individual. It isn't a character reason. He's actually one of the many characters that are a bland, personality-free vessel. Exuki's complete misinterpretation of Radiguet and Kuros's in particular led to both of them eventually devolving into his inner desires for Kimberly and Mako, no matter how little sense that made. Continued in Part 2.